The photograph was taken on a Tuesday evening in October, during golden hour, in a kitchen that didn't belong to her. She stood beside a marble countertop imported from Calcutta, Italy, wearing a Hermes scarf she'd borrowed from the master bedroom 3 hours earlier. The lighting was perfect, the kind of light that makes everything look like it costs more than it does. Behind her, floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Atlantic Ocean like a painting someone else had bought. The caption read, "Autumn at home. Nothing beats an evening like this." She hit post and waited for the likes to accumulate. In another kitchen, 40 miles away, a woman named Catherine was scrolling through Instagram while her daughter did homework at the breakfast table. Catherine had employed this woman for 9 months. She knew her salary. She knew she lived in the staff quarters above the garage. She also knew with absolute certainty that the necklace around her neck in this photograph was the vintage Cartier she kept in her jewelry safe. The one she'd inherited from her mother, the one she wore only on special occasions. Catherine's stomach tightened. She clicked on the profile again. The photograph was real. The woman in it was real. But the life being presented, the casual ownership, the ease, the implied permanence of belonging, that was a construction. Catherine scrolled through more images. There was the Gucci bag she'd mentioned to her husband just last week. There was the car from the driveway, photographed from the passenger seat with the caption, "Treating myself." There was a dinner table she recognized, not from her own home, but from another employer's home, 1 town over. Catherine called her neighbor, Michelle. Michelle had also employed this woman. Michelle had also noticed small things going missing, or rather, appearing in places where they shouldn't be. A silk blouse. Never returned. A pair of shoes from the master closet. Michelle had attributed it to forgetfulness, to the ease of a live-in arrangement where boundaries blur. Now, looking at the photographs, Michelle understood. The boundaries hadn't blurred. They had been deliberately erased. What they didn't yet know was that this was the third state, that there were at least 7 families who had employed her, that she had refined this particular method of living to something close to perfection. What they didn't know was that the moment they recognized that necklace, the entire constructed world she had built would begin to collapse. Not suddenly, but inevitably, like a structure built on a foundation that was never meant to support weight. She had no idea, when she posted that photograph, that she had made a mistake, that she had underestimated the attention of people she had trained herself to think of as background, as the audience to her performance rather than as observers with their own awareness, their own memories, their own photograph collections. She had believed, in that moment, that she was finally safe, that she had finally found a way to belong. But belonging, when it's built on borrowed things, is always temporary. What would you have done differently at that moment? If you'd been Catherine, scrolling through that feed, would you have seen it immediately? Or would you have scrolled past, assuming the photograph belonged to someone else's life, someone who had earned the right to casual ownership? This is the story of how a woman learned to live as someone else. It's the story of the families who failed to see her. And it's the story of what happens when the performance becomes so complete that the performer forgets where the act ends and the person begins. Her name was Rachel, though that was one of several names she'd used in the past 5 years. She was born in Allentown, Pennsylvania, to a mother who cleaned houses and a father who disappeared when she was 4. She spent her childhood watching her mother move through other people's homes, dusting their shelves, washing their windows, folding their clothes, and she watched the way her mother became invisible in those spaces. Not invisible in the sense of being unseen, but invisible in the sense of being beneath notice. Her mother would emerge from someone's master bedroom with their laundry folded and stacked, and the owner of that bedroom would walk past her without acknowledgement, the way you might walk past a chair or a table. Rachel understood very early that there were 2 kinds of people: those who owned spaces and those who serviced them. She understood that her mother would never be the first kind. She understood that this was not an accident of circumstance but a kind of permanent condition, a ceiling that had been built into the architecture of their lives before she was even born. When Rachel was 12, her mother brought home a Pottery Barn catalog. Rachel's mother had cleaned the home of the woman who received this catalog, and the woman had left it on the kitchen counter after flipping through it. Rachel's mother had taken it, not as a theft, but as a kind of permission to dream. They sat together on their apartment bed and looked at photographs of bedrooms that seemed to exist in a different world. Neutral tones. Sunlight streaming through windows that opened onto something green. Furniture that had been chosen, not accumulated. In one photograph, a woman stood in a kitchen similar to Rachel's mother's employer's kitchen, but this woman was smiling, and she was holding a coffee mug, and she looked like someone who had made a choice about her life rather than simply living it. "That's what I want for you," her mother had said, pointing at the photograph. "Not the things. The feeling. The feeling that you belong somewhere." Rachel's mother died when Rachel was 23. Pneumonia, untreated, because she didn't have insurance and couldn't afford to lose the hours at work. She died in their apartment, in the bed they'd bought together at a second-hand store, and Rachel sat beside her in the dark and understood that her mother's entire life had been a kind of temporary arrangement. All of it, the jobs, the homes she cleaned, the daughter she raised, had been borrowed time. After the funeral, Rachel couldn't go back to the life she'd been living. She'd been working at a restaurant, saving money, thinking about community college. But community college meant staying in Allentown. It meant staying visible, staying in the category of people who were seen but not valued. It meant inheriting her mother's permanent condition. So Rachel did something else. She changed her name. Not legally. She didn't have the money or the knowledge for that. She simply became someone else. She took a job as live-in household staff for a family in the Berkshires, and she moved into a room that belonged to them, and she became the kind of person who was invisible. The kind of person who moved through spaces without being fully noticed. The kind of person who knew all the family's secrets because she was present in moments they'd forgotten to guard themselves. But invisibility, she discovered, was not the same as belonging. It was the opposite. It was erasure with a paycheck. After 6 months, she noticed something. The family's teenage daughter had a closet full of clothes that she never wore. Designer pieces, expensive fabrics, items that had been purchased and abandoned. One evening, when the family was out, Rachel tried on a dress. It was a Chanel piece, simple and elegant, the kind of dress that looked effortless on the woman who could afford it. On Rachel, it looked like a transformation. She looked in the mirror and saw someone different. Someone who belonged in a space like this. She posted a photograph of herself in that dress, standing in the kitchen where she worked, with the sunset visible through the window. She used a fake Instagram account, under a different name. The photograph got 47 likes. Most of them were from accounts she didn't recognize. People who saw the image and saw a woman of leisure, a woman who lived in beautiful spaces, a woman who had the luxury of taking photographs during golden hour. Rachel realized something in that moment. The photograph was a kind of proof. It was proof that she could be someone else. That if she could convince strangers on the internet, she could convince anyone. That if she could create an image that looked real enough, the reality didn't matter. What mattered was the narrative. What mattered was the performance. Over the next 3 years, she perfected the method. She moved to 3 different states. She took jobs as live-in household staff in wealthy communities. The Hamptons, the San Francisco Bay Area, a suburb of Chicago. In each place, she lived 2 lives simultaneously. During the day, she was invisible. She cleaned, she cooked, she maintained the household. She was the kind of person you might pass in a hallway and not quite remember. At night, and on her rare days off, she became someone else. She borrowed clothes. She borrowed jewelry. She borrowed cars. She used the family's homes as backdrops for photographs. She hosted private dinners in their kitchens, inviting people she'd met. People who assumed she was part of that world, that she owned the space, that she had simply chosen to spend her evening cooking for friends. The Instagram accounts multiplied. In some versions of her life, she was a lifestyle influencer. In others, she was an heiress recovering from travel abroad. In others, she was simply a woman living a beautiful life. The narrative shifted depending on the context, but the core remained the same. She was performing the life her mother had never had. She was performing belonging. What does it mean to become someone else? Not in the dramatic sense of a complete reinvention, but in the smaller, incremental sense of performing a role so consistently that you begin to believe it yourself. Rachel had crossed that threshold. She no longer experienced these borrowed lives as temporary experiments. She experienced them as her real life. The staff quarters, the invisible labor, the erasure of her actual self, that was the performance. The rest was real. Except it wasn't. None of it was real. And the moment when she would have to acknowledge that truth was already approaching. Have you ever realized, partway through a lie, that you've lost track of where the truth ended? That you've been performing a version of yourself for so long that you can't quite remember what the original was? That's where Rachel was. Lost in the performance. Believing in a life that didn't actually exist. Performing ownership of things that would never be hers. Her mother had wanted her to feel like she belonged somewhere. Instead, Rachel had learned to perform the feeling so convincingly that she'd forgotten it was an act. Not every family was suitable. Rachel had learned this through trial and error. Mostly error. The first family she'd worked for, the one in the Berkshires, had been too aware. They noticed immediately when things went missing. The mother kept an inventory of her clothes the way some people keep an inventory of their art collection. She would comment on items Rachel wore, asking where they'd come from, mentioning that she'd never seen that blouse before, that it looked familiar. The father was similarly attentive. They had built a life around the accumulation and cataloging of beautiful things, which meant they knew their beautiful things. They noticed when those things moved. Rachel had lasted 4 months there before she understood. This family was not suited to her design. They were too present in their own lives. They paid attention. So she developed a profile. Over the course of 3 states and 7 families, she identified the characteristics of a suitable target. Suitable families had certain things in common. First, wealth that exceeded awareness. They had so many things. Clothes they never wore, jewelry they forgot they owned, cars they let sit idle, that their inventory was naturally chaotic. A woman with 5 purses might not notice when a 6th circulates through different contexts. A man with a closet full of watches might not track which ones are on his wrist. Second, distraction. Families that were consumed with their own lives, custody battles, affairs, career obsessions, substance abuse, didn't notice the staff. Rachel learned to identify the families in crisis. These were families where the parents were so focused on their own problems that they'd abdicated presence. The children were in the care of nannies and teachers. The household was managed by other people. No one was actually paying attention. Third, guilt. This was the most reliable indicator. Families who felt guilty about their wealth, for whatever reason, were reluctant to interrogate it. If something went missing, they were more likely to assume they'd misplaced it than to accuse their employee. Guilt made them lenient. Guilt made them look away. The family in the Hamptons, the Hendersons, had all 3 characteristics in abundance. David Henderson was a hedge fund manager who'd built his wealth by taking calculated risks. He was still taking them, though lately the risks had less to do with markets and more to do with a woman named Stephanie who worked in his office. His wife, Catherine, knew something was wrong but not the specific details. She filled the absence of knowledge with resentment. She'd become someone who drank wine at lunch and made cutting remarks at dinner parties. She was present in her home but not engaged with it. Their daughter, Emma, was 14 and absorbed in her phone. Their son, James, was 12 and shuttled between school and sports. Neither child had a relationship with Rachel beyond the transactional. She was the person who made their lunch and drove them to practice. They didn't see her as human. They certainly didn't see her as someone who might be living a secret life in the spaces they occupied. The house itself was a sprawl of modern architecture on 5 acres of manicured lawn. It had been built by a famous designer whose name appeared in magazines. It was meant to look effortless, though of course nothing about it was effortless. Every element had been chosen to convey a specific message. We belong here, we are successful, we have impeccable taste. The kitchen was the heart of this message, a space designed to be photographed, with marble counters and professional-grade appliances and windows that framed the ocean like a painting. Catherine spent little time in this kitchen. She spent most of her time avoiding her husband and her marriage. She had no close friends in the community. She attended charity events and performed the role of the successful wife, but the performance was hollow. She was going through the motions of a life that had lost its meaning. Rachel recognized all of this immediately. Catherine was distracted by her own unhappiness. David was distracted by his affair. Neither of them was paying attention to what was happening in their own home. The first time Rachel borrowed Catherine's Hermes scarf, it was almost an accident. She was cleaning the master bedroom, and the scarf was draped over a chair, and she found herself wondering what it would feel like to wear it. She took it to her room, put it on, and looked at herself in the mirror. The scarf transformed her. It made her look like someone who had taste, who understood luxury, who belonged in beautiful spaces. She took a photograph of herself wearing it, just the scarf and her neck and shoulders, the staff quarters framed in soft focus behind her. She posted it with the caption, "Quiet Morning." It got 72 likes. The next time she borrowed something, it was intentional. Catherine had a closet full of clothes she'd purchased and never worn. She bought things compulsively, Rachel had noticed. She bought them as a way of filling the void her marriage had created. The clothes accumulated, and Catherine felt guilty about the waste, so she didn't wear them. This was the pattern: purchase, guilt, abandonment. Rachel began borrowing strategically. A dress for one evening, photographed in the kitchen during golden hour. A pair of shoes for another. She was careful to return them before they were missed. She was careful to fold them the way they'd been folded, to place them in the exact spot where they'd been left. But she was also testing Catherine's awareness. She was watching to see if Catherine would notice. Catherine didn't. Catherine was too consumed by her own misery to track her own possessions. She moved through her house like a ghost, present but not present, aware but not aware. Rachel began to escalate. She borrowed jewelry, costume pieces at first, then more valuable items. She borrowed the Cartier necklace one evening and wore it to a dinner she hosted at the house, using Catherine's recipes and Catherine's kitchen and Catherine's wine collection. The guests she'd invited, people she'd met at the grocery store and the coffee shop, didn't question her right to be there. They saw the house, the jewelry, the ease with which she moved through the space, and they assumed she had earned the right to occupy it. She posted photographs from that dinner. Hosting tonight. Good friends, good food, good company. The posts accumulated likes from people who saw the image and saw a woman living a life of leisure, a woman who hosted dinners in homes with ocean views, a woman who had taste and resources and the kind of life that Instagram made visible. What Rachel didn't understand, in those moments, was the psychology of the victim. Catherine wasn't failing to notice because she was careless. Catherine was failing to notice because she was in denial. On some level, Catherine knew her marriage was failing. On some level, she knew her children were growing up without her. On some level, she knew that her life had become hollow. And when you're in that state of denial, you don't see the small infractions happening around you. You see only your own unhappiness. You see only the spaces where meaning used to be. The families Rachel targeted weren't unaware. They were choosing not to be aware. And Rachel had learned to recognize that choice. She had learned to exploit the gap between what people could see and what they were willing to see. Did you see the targeting mechanism at work here? The way Rachel identified not the families with the least security, but the families with the most internal chaos? The way she recognized that distraction was a kind of permission? Think about your own life. What are you not seeing because you're too consumed with your own unhappiness? What small transgressions are happening in the spaces you've stopped paying attention to? This is the way deception works. not through sophistication, but through our own willingness to remain blind. Identity is a story we tell ourselves about who we are. For most people, this story develops gradually over time, informed by experience, feedback, relationships. But Rachel had learned something different. She had learned that identity could be constructed deliberately. That if you told the story convincingly enough, to others and to yourself, the distinction between the constructed self and the authentic self would eventually blur beyond recognition. The Rachel that existed in Catherine's home had a name: Lily. Lily was the name she used on her fake Instagram accounts, though she'd used variations of it in other states and with other families. Lily was curated and deliberate. Lily was born fully formed from the internet, which meant she had no childhood trauma, no absent father, no mother who died cleaning other people's homes. Lily had simply always existed in these spaces. Lily belonged. To construct Lily convincingly, Rachel understood she had to attend to details that went beyond the visual. Visual elements were the easiest: the clothes, the jewelry, the carefully composed photographs. But people could see through visual performance if the internal elements didn't match. So Rachel had to construct Lily's interiority as well. She had to develop a backstory, a set of values, a consistent personality. Lily was from San Francisco originally, or was she from New York? Rachel kept these details vague because vagueness provided flexibility. Lily's parents were either traveling abroad or estranged. She had attended either Vassar or Yale, though she'd taken a few years off after graduating to travel and find herself. She had inherited money, though not a staggering amount. Just enough to explain why she didn't work a traditional job. Just enough to explain why she had leisure time. Lily was well-read. She quoted books she'd actually read. Rachel was a voracious reader, one of the few genuine interests she maintained, but she quoted them in the context of having lived a privileged life that had given her the space to read them. Lily was interested in art and design and social justice in the abstract way that wealthy people sometimes are. She cared about the environment but traveled frequently. She was interested in human rights but used sweatshops labor without interrogation. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of person who belonged in the spaces Rachel was inhabiting. The most important element of Lily's identity was authenticity, or rather, the appearance of authenticity. Rachel understood that people were more likely to believe in an identity that didn't try too hard. An identity that was performed with too much intensity would raise suspicion. So Lily had to be relaxed, natural, as if she didn't need to prove anything because the proof of her belonging was self-evident. This was the most difficult aspect to maintain. Because Rachel, underneath the construction of Lily, was desperate to prove that she belonged. She wanted recognition. She wanted gratitude. She wanted to be acknowledged for how successfully she had infiltrated these spaces. But Lily couldn't want those things. Lily had to be secure enough in her belonging that she didn't need external validation. Lily had to move through spaces as if she owned them, because that was the only way to convince others that she did. Over time, something began to happen that Rachel hadn't anticipated. The line between Lily and herself began to dissolve. She would be in Catherine's kitchen, wearing Catherine's clothes, and she would genuinely forget, for moments at a time, that any of this was borrowed. She would think about the guests arriving for dinner, and she would feel genuine anxiety about whether they would like the food she'd prepared. She would see the photograph she'd taken receiving likes, and she would feel genuine pleasure. Not the pleasure of having fooled people, but the pleasure of being seen as beautiful, as tasteful, as someone who lived a life worth documenting. The psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. The gap between what you believe to be true and what you know to be true becomes so wide that your mind has to find a way to bridge it. One way to bridge it is to gradually start believing the constructed narrative, to let the performance become the reality. Rachel was experiencing a kind of fragmentation. She inhabited two distinct identities. In one, she was an invisible woman working as household staff, earning a modest salary, living in a small room. In the other, she was Lily, a woman of means and leisure, someone who hosted dinners and wore jewelry and belonged in beautiful spaces. These two identities were becoming increasingly separate, increasingly irreconcilable. The question that haunted her, though she wouldn't have been able to articulate it clearly, was which one was real? Was Rachel the authentic identity and Lily the performance? Or had she been performing Rachel all this time, and Lily was the authentic self she'd been waiting to become? Catherine, watching Rachel move through the house, had no idea about any of this. Catherine saw only what was in front of her, a competent household employee who kept the house running smoothly, who didn't ask for much, who didn't make demands. Rachel had become nearly invisible to Catherine, which was precisely what Rachel wanted. Invisibility was the condition that allowed her to perform her other life. As long as Catherine didn't see her, Rachel could be someone else. But there was a cost to this invisibility, though Rachel didn't fully understand it yet. The cost was that Catherine could never actually know her. Rachel could never be acknowledged for who she was, because she had erased who she was. She had made herself invisible so that she could perform someone else. And in doing so, she had ensured that neither identity was fully real. Neither Rachel nor Lily was a complete person. Both were incomplete fragments of a self that had been shattered in the attempt to belong. When you construct an identity entirely from the outside, from clothes and photographs and the performance of leisure, you eventually realize that no amount of external validation will make you feel like you actually belong. Because belonging, real belonging, requires being known. It requires someone to see you and acknowledge you and say, yes, you fit here. But Rachel could never have that. Because the moment someone truly saw her, the entire construction would collapse. She understood this, somewhere deep in her consciousness. She understood that she was building a house that would eventually burn down. But she was so tired of being invisible that she couldn't stop. She kept borrowing. She kept performing. She kept constructing new versions of herself, each one more elaborate than the last. She kept telling herself that this time would be different. This time, the performance would become real. What does this reveal about the gap between who we are and who we present ourselves as? All of us curate our identities to some degree. We all perform versions of ourselves for different audiences. But most of us maintain some kind of core, some sense that underneath the performances, there's an authentic self. What happens when you've performed so long that you can no longer access that core? What happens when you've become such a successful actor that you can no longer remember who was acting in the first place? If this exploration of identity and authenticity resonates with you, leave a like. The moment of genuine connection is the most dangerous moment in any deception. It's the moment when the performance touches something real. It's the moment when the victim begins to see the deceiver as human, when the narrative starts to move beyond the surface, when vulnerability enters the equation. For Catherine, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in late spring. The house was quiet. David was at his office. The children were at school. Rachel was organizing the pantry, doing one of the 1,000 small tasks that kept the house functioning invisibly. Catherine came into the kitchen, not because she needed anything specifically, but because she was restless. She'd been restless for months. She'd been drinking more. She'd been sleeping less. She'd been aware, on some level, that her marriage was ending, and she didn't know how to stop it. Rachel was standing on a step stool, arranging items on a high shelf. She had her back to Catherine. She didn't know Catherine was there until Catherine spoke. "Does it ever feel like you're performing your own life?" Catherine asked. "Like you're watching yourself do things, but you're not actually the one doing them?" It was a strange question to ask a household employee. It was a question that suggested Catherine saw Rachel as more than just the help. It was a question that contained vulnerability. Rachel turned around. She could have given a simple answer, something that maintained the professional distance between them. Instead, something happened inside her. Some part of the constructed identity Lily had been wearing cracked, and something more authentic came through. "All the time," Rachel said. Catherine sat down at the kitchen counter. She didn't ask Rachel to come down from the step stool. She didn't establish any of the normal hierarchies. She just sat there, as if they were two people having a conversation, rather than an employer and an employee. "I think I'm having a nervous breakdown," Catherine said. "I have everything. The house, the money, the family. And I feel like I'm dying. Like I'm disappearing. Do you ever feel like that?" Rachel came down from the step stool. She sat on the bar stool next to Catherine. And then she did something she hadn't done before. She told Catherine part of the truth. "My mother died when I was younger," Rachel said. "And after she died, I felt like I had to become someone else. Like the person I'd been before wasn't enough. Like I had to be different to survive." Catherine looked at her with something that might have been recognition. "I think that's what I've been doing," she said. "Becoming someone I'm not. And I don't know how to go back." This was the moment when everything changed. This was the moment when the performance touched something real. Because Rachel wasn't lying. Not entirely. She was drawing on genuine pain. She was accessing genuine loss. And Catherine, in her own vulnerability, was responding to that authenticity. From that moment forward, Catherine began to see Rachel differently. She began to treat her less like an employee and more like a confidant. She would share things with Rachel that she wouldn't share with her therapist. Rachel became the person Catherine talked to when her marriage was falling apart. Rachel became the person who listened and validated and offered perspective. And Rachel, in turn, became more invested in maintaining the connection. Because this was different from the other families. This was a relationship based on something deeper than performance. This was a relationship based on mutual vulnerability. But here's the thing about deception. The deeper the genuine connection, the more devastating the eventual betrayal. Because what Catherine was responding to wasn't entirely Lily. What Catherine was responding to was a real part of Rachel. The part that had experienced loss. The part that understood what it meant to feel like you were disappearing. But Catherine didn't know that Rachel was simultaneously betraying her. That Rachel was borrowing her things, living her life, performing her ownership of her home and her possessions. That Rachel was using Catherine's vulnerability against her, even if not entirely intentionally. Rachel didn't wake up and think, "I'm going to manipulate this woman's emotional vulnerability to steal her things." It wasn't that calculated. It was more subtle than that. Rachel had developed the ability to compartmentalize. She could be genuinely present with Catherine's pain on Monday afternoon, and then on Monday evening, she could borrow Catherine's jewelry and host a dinner in Catherine's kitchen under a false identity. The two things existed in completely separate compartments. They didn't touch. The psychology of this is complex. Rachel had fractured herself so thoroughly that she was capable of genuine empathy and genuine deception simultaneously. She could care about Catherine and exploit her at the same time. She could see Catherine's pain and use it. Not from a place of malice. Rachel wasn't a malicious person, but from a place of necessity. She needed the performance. She needed the borrowed life. And she had convinced herself that she deserved it. That after a lifetime of invisibility and erasure, she had earned the right to occupy someone else's space. Catherine, meanwhile, was experiencing what psychologists call the savior narrative. She had begun to see herself as Rachel's ally. Someone had finally treated her like she mattered. Someone had finally listened to her. Someone had finally seen her as human. She didn't know that this someone was simultaneously betraying her. She didn't know that the empathy she was experiencing was being weaponized against her. This is how deception works at its most insidious level. Not through crude manipulation, but through the exploitation of genuine human needs. Both Rachel and Catherine needed to be seen. Both of them were experiencing invisibility in their own ways. Rachel's invisibility was structural. She was the help, the servant, the person whose presence was necessary but unacknowledged. Catherine's invisibility was existential. She had everything but felt like she was disappearing inside her own life. They recognized in each other the pain of not being seen. And for a moment, they did see each other. They had a genuine moment of human connection, but it was built on a foundation of lies. And that foundation couldn't hold. Share with someone who loves understanding human nature. Dependency is not an accident. It's a process. It begins subtly. A person becomes necessary in small ways, and then in larger ways, until their absence becomes unimaginable. The victim doesn't realize this is happening because the process is gradual. They experience it as someone becoming more important to them, someone they value more and more. They don't recognize it as a trap until they're already caught. Catherine became increasingly dependent on Rachel. Not in the practical sense. Rachel was already managing the household, but in the emotional sense. Catherine would wait for Rachel to wake up in the morning so she could talk to her. She would linger in the kitchen while Rachel prepared meals, sharing thoughts and fears and resentments. She began to tell Rachel things she hadn't told anyone else. She told her about David's affair, not because she'd caught him, but because she knew. She told her about her fears that she'd wasted her life. She told her about her mother, who had never approved of her marriage, who had raised her to expect more. She told her about the medication she was taking, the therapy she'd attempted, the ways she felt like a failure. Rachel listened to all of this. And Rachel did something that is perhaps the most damaging thing one person can do to another. She validated Catherine's belief that Catherine understood her. She created the illusion that in Catherine had finally found someone who truly saw her, truly understood her, truly cared about her more than anyone else. "You're the only person who really knows me," Catherine said to Rachel one afternoon. It was a statement that should have alarmed Rachel. It should have created a moment of conscience. It should have made Rachel realize that she was doing something deeply harmful. Instead, Rachel felt something else. She felt powerful. She felt necessary. She felt like her presence mattered. At the same time, Rachel was deepening her theft. She was no longer borrowing items for a few hours and returning them. She was taking things and using them multiple times. She was hosting dinners once a week. She was wearing Catherine's jewelry regularly. She was using the house as the backdrop for an increasingly elaborate online persona. The photographs had become more sophisticated. Rachel had developed a consistent aesthetic. She had learned lighting and composition. She had learned how to make moments look effortless and authentic, the way that only truly wealthy people can. She had thousands of followers now, across multiple accounts. People who commented on her posts, who appreciated her taste, who wanted to know her product recommendations and her favorite restaurants and where she shopped. The irony, of course, is that Rachel didn't actually shop. Every item she posted about was borrowed. Every luxury she performed was someone else's. She had built an entire identity on the foundation of things that would never be hers. And the more followers she accumulated, the more real that identity felt. Because thousands of people were validating it. Thousands of people were saying, yes, this life you're presenting is real, is valuable, is worth aspiring to. What Rachel was experiencing is something that researchers call amplified identity confirmation. The more external validation she received for the constructed identity, the more she began to believe in it. Her brain was literally being rewired by the positive feedback. She was becoming addicted to the performance in the way that someone becomes addicted to a substance. Each like, each comment, each new follower was a hit of dopamine. Each photograph that received praise reinforced the neural pathways that made her believe she was Lily, that she belonged, that she was finally someone. Catherine, meanwhile, was becoming more and more isolated. She had given Rachel her trust and her vulnerability, and in doing so, she had cut herself off from other relationships. She wasn't confiding in her friends. She wasn't being honest with her therapist. She wasn't having real conversations with her husband. Rachel had become the sole container for her emotional life. And Rachel was using that container against her. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. Because if Catherine ever fully saw what Rachel was doing, if Catherine ever looked closely at those borrowed items, those photographs, that elaborate fiction, the entire relationship would collapse. So Rachel had to keep Catherine focused on Catherine's own pain. She had to keep Catherine so engaged with her own emotional crisis that she wouldn't notice the betrayal happening in plain sight. This is called emotional enmeshment. It's a psychological state where one person's sense of self becomes so intertwined with another person's sense of self that they can no longer maintain healthy boundaries. Catherine's identity had become partially dependent on being seen and understood by Rachel. Rachel had made herself indispensable. And the cost of Rachel being indispensable was that Catherine had to remain blind. The blindness was mutual, though in different ways. Catherine was blind to what Rachel was doing. But Rachel was also becoming blind to what this was costing Catherine. Rachel had convinced herself that her actions were victimless. That she was taking things that nobody really needed, from people who had so much that they wouldn't miss them. That she was simply correcting an injustice, redistributing wealth from the haves to the have-not. But Catherine was being harmed. Not because the items were missing. Catherine had so many possessions that she didn't miss them. But because she was being betrayed by the one person she'd trusted. Because she was investing her emotional life in someone who was simultaneously using her. Because the gap between Catherine's reality and Catherine's perception of reality was widening every day. And Rachel was becoming increasingly unstable underneath the performance. She was exhausted. She was maintaining multiple identities across multiple platforms and multiple physical spaces. She was living a constant lie, and the lie was becoming more elaborate and more difficult to maintain. She was sleeping poorly. She was experiencing anxiety and paranoia. She was checking her Instagram accounts dozens of times a day, monitoring comments, managing the narrative. She was losing the distinction between her real life and the performance. Some nights, she didn't know which version of herself would wake up in the morning. The psychological term for this is dissociation. It's what happens when the gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be becomes so wide that your mind begins to fracture. You stop feeling real. You start feeling like you're watching yourself from a distance. You stop knowing what you actually want versus what you think you should want. Rachel was approaching this state. She was living in a kind of constant alert, a hypervigilance. She was checking doors to make sure they were locked. She was monitoring Catherine's movements to ensure she wouldn't discover the theft. She was constructing ever more elaborate stories to explain inconsistencies. She was trapped in a network of lies that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. What would you do at this moment if you were Rachel? If you were aware, at some level, that what you were doing was unsustainable? If you understood that eventually you would be caught, and the moment of exposure would be devastating? Would you confess? Would you try to make amends? Or would you, like Rachel, simply double down? Simply tell yourself that you just need to be more careful, that you just need to manage the performance more skillfully, that you just need to sustain it a little longer until you've achieved something, until you've won something, until you've finally proven that you belong? Most people, if they're honest, would choose Rachel's path. They would choose to sustain the lie, because confession is terrifying. And Catherine would forgive you if you confessed now, when the betrayal is still relatively small. But you can't go back to that moment. You can only move forward into deeper betrayal. If this exploration of psychological dependency resonated with you, subscribe. New explorations of deception and psychology every week. Every deception reaches a moment where the path diverges. In that moment, the deceiver has a choice: continue deeper or retreat. Most people think of this moment as dramatic, a sudden discovery, a confrontation, a moment of crisis. But the most dangerous deceptions are the ones where this moment is quiet, where it passes almost unnoticed, where the deceiver makes the choice to deepen the lie before they even fully realize they're making it. For Rachel, The moment came not suddenly, but over a series of days. It began with a small oversight. She had borrowed a vintage Rolex from Catherine's jewelry safe, the safe to which Catherine had carelessly mentioned the combination, back when Catherine still believed Rachel was simply the help. Rachel wore the watch to a dinner party. Someone complimented it. Someone else asked what model it was. Rachel found herself elaborating. She'd inherited it from her grandfather, she said. It had been passed down through her family. She wore it only on special occasions. She took a photograph of the watch, the afternoon light hitting the dial just right. She posted it with the caption, "Some things you keep because of who gave them to you, not because of what they cost." The post got 374 likes. In the comments, someone asked where she'd gotten it. She responded, "Vintage dealer in the city. Happy to share the info if you're interested." She was making up shops that didn't exist, dealers she'd never met. She was constructing a backstory for a watch that wasn't hers, for a life that didn't belong to her. 3 days later, Catherine asked to wear the watch. Catherine was attending a gala, and she wanted something elegant. She went to her jewelry safe and found it empty. She looked through her other boxes, her drawer, every place the watch might have been. She couldn't find it. Catherine asked Rachel if she'd seen it. Rachel's heart rate accelerated. Her mind raced through possibilities. She could confess. She could tell Catherine that she'd borrowed it. She could explain that she'd gotten caught up in performing a life that wasn't hers, and she'd gone too far. She could throw herself on Catherine's mercy. But instead, Rachel said, "No, I haven't seen it. Did you check the jewelry safe?" Catherine had checked the jewelry safe. The watch wasn't there. What happened in the next hour was a kind of dance. Catherine retraced her steps. She remembered wearing the watch last. When? A month ago. 2 months ago. Catherine's mind wasn't reliable anymore. She was drinking more. She wasn't sleeping. Her sense of temporal progression had become slurred. She couldn't remember exactly when she'd last seen the watch. Rachel watched this process. Rachel watched Catherine's confusion. And Rachel made a choice. She decided to help Catherine. She offered to search the house. She offered to retrace Catherine's steps. She performed the role of concerned household staff member. And while Catherine was distracted, while Catherine was looking in the master bedroom, Rachel retrieved the watch from her room and placed it in a place where Catherine might have left it. On the desk in the study. Exactly where someone might have put down a watch if they'd been sitting at their desk. Catherine found it within an hour. Catherine apologized to Rachel for suspecting, though Rachel had never explicitly implied that Rachel had taken it. Catherine attributed the lapse to her own unreliability. She hugged Rachel and thanked her for her help. She said something about her mind going. She said something about how lost she felt. In that moment, Rachel had crossed a line. She hadn't just stolen. She'd lied about the theft. She'd manipulated the evidence. She'd made Catherine doubt her own memory and perception. And she'd done it successfully. Catherine had believed her. Catherine had trusted her even in the moment when Catherine should have been questioning her most. This is what psychologists call gaslighting. The subtle manipulation of another person's perception of reality. Rachel had done it without intention, without forethought. She had done it simply because it was necessary. Because the moment Catherine started to question her, the performance would unravel. But something shifted in Rachel after that moment. She understood that she was no longer capable of turning back. That confession was no longer an option. That the only way forward was deeper into the lie. Because the moment she confessed now, she wouldn't be confessing to simple theft. She would be confessing to psychological manipulation, to betrayal of trust, to gaslighting. So Rachel doubled down. She borrowed more. She performed more. She became even more invested in maintaining the lie. She created a new Instagram account with even more sophisticated content. She began to attend social events where she positioned herself in the background of other people's photographs, building a false history of belonging to communities she'd never actually joined. She hired a photographer to take professional portraits in Catherine's home, marketing herself as a lifestyle influencer open to brand partnerships. The performance had achieved a kind of critical mass. It was no longer just about borrowing things. It was about building an alternative reality, an entire identity that existed primarily in the digital realm but that was becoming increasingly more real than her actual life. At the same time, Catherine was deteriorating. The loss of the watch, and then the recovery of the watch, had unsettled something in her. She was becoming increasingly unstable. She was drinking more. She was becoming paranoid that she was losing her mind. David suggested that maybe she should check herself into a facility. Her therapist was worried. Her children were scared. Catherine clung to Rachel more desperately than ever. Rachel was the only person who seemed to understand her, the only person who wasn't trying to fix her or judge her. Rachel had become her lifeline. And Rachel, knowing this, continued to betray her. Because Rachel had understood something crucial. Catherine would never leave. Catherine was too invested in the relationship now. Catherine's sense of self was too dependent on Rachel's validation. Rachel had won. She had trapped Catherine so thoroughly in emotional enmeshment that Catherine could no longer function without her. But winning felt like losing. Because the more Rachel won, the more trapped she felt herself. The performance required constant maintenance. The borrowed life required constant performance. Rachel wasn't sleeping. Rachel was developing health problems, panic attacks, digestive issues, the physical manifestations of sustained anxiety. Rachel was fragmenting. Did you see the moment where Rachel could have stopped? It came and went in the span of a few hours. It's easy to judge Rachel for not taking it. It's easy to say that you would have confessed, that you would have set things right. But Rachel had spent her entire life learning to believe that her needs mattered more than other people's. Her mother had taught her that by dying, by leaving her without resources or support, by showing her that the world would not protect you, that the only way to survive was to take what you needed, regardless of the cost to others. Rachel wasn't evil. She was broken. And the broken things we do to survive eventually become the broken things we do to ourselves. Have you experienced the moment where you could have turned back, but didn't? Where you understood you were crossing a line, but you crossed it anyway? What did you tell yourself to make the crossing possible? The collapse, when it came, wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of exposure that felt like a breaking point. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of small failures. A photograph taken at an angle that revealed too much. A caption that didn't quite match the aesthetic of the room. A borrowed item that appeared in multiple Instagram accounts belonging to different people. Details began to overlap in ways that made pattern recognition possible. It started with Michelle, Catherine's neighbor. Michelle had employed Rachel in a different home, 2 years earlier, in the same Hamptons community. Michelle was scrolling through Instagram one evening when she saw a photograph of the Hermès bag. The same vintage Constance that Michelle had inherited from her mother, the same distinctive clasp, the same patina. The photograph was posted by someone named Lily, from a different account, with a caption about investing in classics. Michelle zoomed in. She looked at the other photographs in that account. She saw the same necklace she'd thought she'd lost. She saw the same dining room she'd had in her previous house. Michelle called Catherine. Catherine, who was already fragile, already unstable, felt her world tilt. She looked through the account. She began to see all the items she'd thought she'd misplaced, all the things she'd attributed to her own deteriorating memory. There, in photographs, was proof that she hadn't been losing her mind. There was proof that she had been deliberately deceived. The two women called the police. The police began an investigation. They subpoenaed Instagram records. They traced Rachel's IP addresses. They built a timeline of her movements across 3 states. They documented 7 families over 5 years. When the police arrived at Catherine's house to arrest Rachel, Catherine was there. Catherine watched as the officers took Rachel away. Rachel didn't resist. She didn't cry. She simply accepted that the performance was over, that the borrowed life had reached its expiration date. What happened next was the unraveling of all the compartmentalized pieces of Rachel's fractured self. The families came forward. Each one had a story of small items going missing, of inconsistencies that hadn't quite made sense, of a feeling that something was off. But none of them had wanted to believe it. It was easier to assume forgetfulness than to assume betrayal. It was easier to lose the items than to lose the sense of trust in their own homes. The social media accounts were shut down. The photographs of a life that didn't exist were removed from the internet. The carefully constructed persona of Lily was deleted. In some ways, this was the most devastating moment for Rachel. Not the criminal charges, but the erasure of the only identity that had felt real. Catherine's unraveling was different but equally complete. She had to confront the fact that she'd been betrayed by the one person she'd trusted most. She had to acknowledge that her emotional crisis had made her vulnerable to exploitation. She had to understand that all those intimate conversations she'd had with Rachel had been weaponized against her. She had to face the fact that she'd been gaslighted, that her sense of reality had been deliberately manipulated, and that she'd believed the manipulations. The psychological aftermath was significant. Catherine developed complex PTSD. She couldn't trust anyone. She couldn't trust her own judgment. She became hypervigilant in her own home. She started medication. She started therapy with a new therapist. She separated from her husband, who she realized had been emotionally unavailable long before Rachel arrived. The separation process was brutal. Her children were angry and confused. Her social community, the same community that had never really known her, began to distance themselves. But Catherine also experienced something unexpected. She experienced relief. Because the narrative of her life had been clarified. She wasn't losing her mind. She hadn't been imagining the inconsistencies. She'd been betrayed, yes, but that betrayal had a concrete cause. And in a strange way, that was easier to process than the previous ambiguity. The previous feeling of being haunted by something she couldn't quite name. Rachel, meanwhile, was facing criminal charges. Theft, burglary, fraud, forgery. The severity of the charges depended on how the prosecutors decided to categorize her crimes. And this is where the legal system's inadequacy in addressing psychological crimes becomes apparent. Rachel's criminal behavior stemmed from severe psychological fracturing, from a lifelong inability to access safety, from a lifelong invisibility, from a mother's early death and the abandonment that followed. But the legal system doesn't have a category for crimes born of psychological desperation. It had categories for theft, and that's what it prosecuted. In jail, waiting for trial, Rachel had nothing but time to process what she'd done. She had no Instagram, no constructed identity, no performance. She was simply Rachel again, the invisible girl whose mother had died, who'd learned that the world wouldn't protect her, who'd learned to take what she needed regardless of the cost. She wrote letters to the families she'd defrauded. In one of these letters, the one to Catherine, she tried to explain. I know explanations don't change anything. I know understanding why I did what I did doesn't make it less harmful. But I want you to know that I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to become someone who deserved to exist. I was trying to make myself visible. My entire life, I've been invisible. My mother died, and I learned that being invisible meant being disposable. So I constructed a life where I wasn't invisible. But the only way I could be visible was to make you invisible. I turned you into a prop in my narrative. I made your pain irrelevant to my performance. And I'm sorry. I'm so deeply sorry. But I know that my sorrow doesn't change anything for you. I know that you're still broken in ways that my apology can never repair. Catherine never responded to the letter. She didn't want Rachel's apologies. She wanted Rachel to understand the extent of the damage. She wanted Rachel to see what her performance had cost. And perhaps the most damaging aspect of the entire situation is that Rachel did understand it, eventually. She understood that her desperate attempt to belong had resulted in making someone else feel like they didn't belong in their own life. Her mother had wanted her to feel belonging, and Rachel had spent her whole life trying to achieve that. And in doing so, she had created the exact inverse. She had created profound alienation. The trial lasted 8 months. Rachel was convicted on multiple counts. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison. In prison, she worked in the kitchen. She was, once again, invisible. She did labor that no one thanked her for. She existed in a system that didn't acknowledge her humanity. It was, in some ways, a mirror of her original condition. She had come full circle. But something changed in Rachel during those 3 years. Without the constant stimulation of the performance, without the reinforcement of the constructed identity, Rachel was forced to confront the actual person underneath. She attended therapy. She read books, actual books, not just the ones that looked good in photographs. She wrote in a journal. She began to understand that the wound her mother's death had created had never actually healed. That she'd spent 30 years running from that pain and had only created more pain in the process. She was released after 2 years for good behavior. She moved to a small town in Vermont. She changed her name officially to Rebecca, a variation of her actual name, a compromise between Rachel and the constructed identity she'd been trying to build. She got a job as a housekeeper. She did the work invisibly, the way her mother had done it. But she did it as an honest exchange of labor for money. She didn't borrow anything. She didn't perform. She simply existed in the margins, doing necessary work that no one noticed. Sometimes she would see photographs from that era on the internet, screenshots that people had saved, images of the person she used to be, and she would feel a complex mix of emotions. Shame, certainly. Regret, certainly. But also a strange kind of recognition. That person had been real too. That person had been her, trying desperately to become someone else. That person had been broken, and breaking others as she tried to become whole. What does this reveal about the relationship between visibility and belonging? Rachel's entire tragedy stemmed from the belief that she had to become someone else to be worthy of existence. That her authentic self was insufficient. That she had to borrow other people's lives in order to justify her own. And the family she deceived had similar wounds. They had everything but felt like they didn't belong in their own lives, felt like they were performing rather than living. The difference was that they had the resources to perform invisibly, while Rachel had to construct an elaborate fiction in order to be seen. The ultimate cost of Rachel's deception wasn't the stolen items. It wasn't the criminal charges or the prison time. The ultimate cost was that she spent 30 years of her life not existing as herself. She became visible only through a lie. She achieved the very invisibility she was trying to escape. She belonged nowhere, not even to herself. Share your own story of deception, as a victim, as a witness, or as someone struggling with the impulse to perform a life that isn't yours. Email velvettraps@gmail.com. These stories help us understand how deception actually works, the psychological patterns that make it possible, the ways we're all vulnerable to the appeal of a borrowed life. We're building a psychology of deception together. Your experience matters. Every story of deception contains a fundamental question. Who is the real victim? We might assume it's Catherine or Michelle, or the other families who discovered that they'd been betrayed by someone they'd invited into their homes. And they were victims, certainly. Their trust was violated. Their sense of reality was manipulated. They had to confront the fact that they'd failed to see someone who'd been present in their lives every day. They had to process the shame and humiliation of having been deceived. But Rachel was also a victim. She was a victim of a childhood that taught her that invisibility was permanent, that worthiness had to be earned, that her authentic self was insufficient. She was a victim of a society that taught her that belonging was conditional on consumption, on the possession of beautiful things, on the performance of a life that justified your existence. What Rachel's story reveals is something we often prefer not to acknowledge. Deception is not simply a moral failing. It's a symptom of a deeper wound. It emerges from places of profound alienation, from the gap between who we are and who we believe we need to be in order to survive. This doesn't excuse Rachel's actions. The families she deceived suffered real harm. Catherine experienced trauma that altered the trajectory of her life. Michelle lost the ability to trust her own judgment. Other families developed security obsessions, began to see their household staff with suspicion, created barriers where there might have been connections. The ripple effects of Rachel's deception extended far beyond the items she stole. But understanding Rachel's wound, understanding the mechanisms that drove her to perform a life that wasn't hers, is essential to understanding something about ourselves. Because the truth is that we're all performing to some degree. We're all curating versions of ourselves for different audiences. We're all managing the gap between who we are and who we want to be seen as. The difference between Rachel and most of us is not that she performed. The difference is that she fractured in the performance. She lost track of which identity was authentic. She became so lost in the construction that she couldn't find her way back to herself. And perhaps that's the central question this narrative explores. At what point does performance become identity? At what point do we lose ourselves so thoroughly in the act that there's no authentic self left to return to? At what point does the borrowed life become the only life we know? For Rachel, that point came gradually. It wasn't a sudden transformation. It was a slow erosion of boundaries between the real and the performed. And by the time she understood what was happening, she was already lost. Catherine's story contains a different kind of tragedy. Catherine had everything but felt like she had nothing. She had a beautiful home and a devastating emptiness inside it. She had financial security and emotional poverty. She had people around her who loved her, but she felt profoundly alone. And when Rachel appeared, this person who seemed to understand her, who seemed to see her, who seemed to validate her experience, Catherine clung to that connection desperately. She became so dependent on being seen by Rachel that she couldn't see Rachel's betrayal even when it was happening in plain sight. What does this reveal about the nature of vulnerability? It reveals that vulnerability is not weakness. It reveals that the people who are most likely to be deceived are often the people who have the most genuine capacity for empathy, for connection, for seeing others. Catherine's openness to Rachel, her willingness to be vulnerable, her need to be understood, these were all qualities that made her a good person. But they also made her exploitable. This is one of the most insidious aspects of deception. It often preys on the qualities we most value in ourselves and in others. It exploits compassion. It uses vulnerability against us. It turns our capacity for connection into a liability. Both Rachel and Catherine were trapped in false narratives about themselves. Rachel believed that she had to become someone else to be worthy. Catherine believed that she was losing her mind, that she was insufficient, that she was failing. And each of them provided what the other needed. Rachel provided validation and presence. Catherine provided access and material resources. They created a symbiotic system of mutual exploitation. The tragedy is not simply that Rachel betrayed Catherine. The tragedy is that both of them were betrayed by a society that doesn't teach us how to belong. A society that teaches us that belonging is conditional on consumption, on performance, on becoming someone other than ourselves. A society that renders certain people invisible, the housekeepers, the service workers, the people who exist in the margins. A society that teaches wealthy people that their belonging is naturally occurring, rather than something that requires cultivation and presence. Rachel and Catherine were both products of the same system. They were both trying to solve impossible problems. Rachel was trying to become visible. Catherine was trying to feel alive. And the mechanism they used to solve these problems was deception. Not necessarily intentional deception, but the quiet deception of going along with the performance, of accepting the narrative that this is what belonging looks like. What would have happened if Rachel had simply told Catherine the truth? If Rachel had said, "I'm from Allentown, Pennsylvania. My mother died when I was 23. I'm afraid that my authentic self isn't enough. I'm afraid that I'll always be invisible unless I become someone else." Would Catherine have responded with compassion? It's possible. Catherine had shown herself to be capable of empathy. But it's also likely that Catherine would have been unable to see Rachel in that moment of vulnerability. Because the narrative Rachel would have been offering, the narrative of invisibility, of insufficiency, would have been too close to Catherine's own experience of herself. Catherine would have been unable to hold space for both her own pain and Rachel's. This brings us back to the central question. What does deception reveal about the gaps in ourselves? What does it show us about the places where we're afraid to be fully seen? The answer is everything. Deception reveals that we're all engaged in some version of performance. We're all creating narratives about ourselves. We're all managing the gap between who we are and who we want to be. Some of these performances are healthy. They're ways of adapting to different contexts, ways of managing social complexity. But others are destructive. They're fractures that spread through our consciousness. They're lies we tell ourselves that eventually consume us. Rachel's tragedy wasn't simply that she was caught. Rachel's tragedy was that she had to lose everything she'd constructed in order to find herself. She had to be stripped of the performance, imprisoned literally and figuratively, before she could begin the process of becoming whole. And even after that process began, she would never fully recover. She would never be able to unknow what she'd become. She would never be able to go back to the moment before she made the choice to deepen the lie instead of confess. Catherine's trajectory was different. Catherine's explosion, her separation from David, her mental health crisis, the disruption of her entire family structure, was the cost she paid for having invested her sense of self so completely in someone else's validation. Catherine had to lose everything in order to learn that her sense of worth couldn't be outsourced to another person. She had to build it from within herself. Both of them are still living with the consequences. Both of them are still processing what happened. Both of them are still asking themselves the questions that deception raises. How do I know what's real? How do I trust myself? How do I trust others? How do I belong without performing? These are the questions that haunt all of us, to varying degrees. These are the questions that make deception possible in the first place. Remember, Velvet Traps exists to explore the psychology of deception, not to celebrate it. If you have a story about trust, betrayal, or the masks we wear, send it to velvettraps@gmail.com. These stories help us understand ourselves and each other. Every submission is read. Your experience is part of this investigation. If this exploration of identity, vulnerability, and the psychology of deception resonated with you like this video, subscribe. New explorations of deception and psychology every week. Share with someone who loves understanding human nature. The spaces between who we are and who we pretend to be are where deception lives. But they're also where understanding lives. The more we're willing to look at those spaces in ourselves, the less likely we are to get lost in them.